Oh, booktube, we are here. We are here to talk about my top 5 fantasy books of all time. Let's do it. Welcome to my new YouTube channel. This is where we go over longer form content. So if you're over here from TikTok, Booktok, I know you all been asking me for longer form content for me to dive deeper into, some of the books that I love, as well as do some vlogs. So this is what this page is gonna be about. If you're new here, you just stumble on my page from YouTube. We're going to be talking about some fire books. We're going to be talking about some dope books. And I always ask you all to share your dope books with me too as well. Books that made you feel how I'm going to portray how I'm feeling in this video here. So definitely let me know in the comments from that perspective. But super excited to start this page. And this is my first booktube video. Be gentle with me. Be gentle. But also give me criticism too as well. Let me know what I could do better. Let me know what's working, what's not working, and we'll go from there. So a couple of housekeeping things. The first thing is the books in the background in terms of them, the layout right there, they're just props. They normally don't sit there, right? So some of them go downstairs, some of them stay upstairs. But I figured for my first booktube video, why not? Let's just have some books in the background, because if you follow me from Booktok, I'm just sitting at my desk. The second thing is, yes, I know, the fireplace in the middle of the summer. I know. I wanted the cozy vibe from there. But let's delay no longer and go over my personal top 5 fantasy books of all time. But we'll delay one more second to kind of talk about why fantasy is my favorite genre there. So when I was like 9 or 10 and Harry Potter Prisoner of Azkaban came out and I read it, it really spurred this moment of being, more of a fantasy genre lover from that perspective there. And, fantasy for me, at least at that age, was to kind of get away from the real world and all the stuff in the real world that I might not have liked that was happening. And maybe I still do the same thing today in terms of getting out of the real world. But that's what really spurred that from there. And fantasy has been my go-to genre since then. So am I expert in terms of all of fantasy? No. So don't take these words as Bible in terms of saying these are the top 5 fantasy books of all time. No, these are my top 5 fantasy books of all time. And I'm really excited to share it with you all. And if you're from Booktok, I think you're already going to see some of these already. But if you're new here, hopefully you found a banger. Delay no longer. Let's go over my top 5 fantasy books of all time. All right. Kicking off at number 5 is a book that I read earlier this year, in February this year. And it was an easy 5 stars for me. 5-star right off the bat. The Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter, to me, was such an epic fantasy for me. And it got me in the groove of this year of just breezing through fantasy book after fantasy book after fantasy book. I didn't really hear much about this book before I read it, right? So I was scouring the net and I was following some different creators on Booktok in general. And this was back when I probably had like 40,000 followers. I think we're at 130,000 or something like that. But this one wasn't really talked about a lot. And I picked it up, and this is an African-inspired fantasy, and it says the Rage of Dragons, and the first part is correct. The Rage is correct. The Dragons part is probably 10%, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4% of the book is dragons. But the Rage is what really drew me in. The revenge tour that this guy goes on, this guy Tao, who is the main character of this book, is like, I describe it as Drake 2016, Arya Stark. Like, he went on a crazy revenge tour, and it kind of reminded me of the Mama mentality in terms of the actual way that he goes on his revenge tour. Kobe Bryant lost the finals in 2008, 2009. He ends up winning, but he wanted that revenge in 2010 against the Celtics. And this one, the gas is lit when it came to this and it came to Tao. This had some great battle scenes. This had some great characters that you really grow to. And this author, Evan Winter, is not afraid to off any one of them. And that brutality made this book a 5-star for me, because beforehand, I might have skated around and like maybe read some plots that had revenge in it, but not full-blown revenge like this. And this one was such a great read for me. Love this book so much, and it's getting a whole lot of recognition now. Book 2 was amazing too. I still didn't think it was as good as this one, but it was a great book leading into book 3. And Evan Winter, we need book 3 now. We need book 3 now. Let us know, man. The Rage of Dragons, one of the best fantasy books for me of all time. Again, I think before I read it on Goodreads, it was like a 4.2. I think now it's at like a 4.3 or 4.5. You all know, because I don't really follow Goodreads like that, but it is giving a good rating right now. The Rated Dragons, my number 5 fantasy book of all time for sure. Coming at number 4 is a book I read last year, and this book's insane. So the Sword of Kaigen, is now all over Booktok, and I think it's on YouTube or BookTube. But if it's not, then it should be, because this book is a Japanese-inspired fantasy, and again, it has some Avatar: Last Airbender vibes to it, mixed with like samurai. You could think of like a Rurouni Kenshin in terms of anime from there too as well. But my goodness, M.L. Wong is, again, if it wasn't for Brandon Sanderson, if M.L. Wong had more works out, she'd be my favorite author of all time. Brandon Sanderson will come a little bit later in terms of the video. M.L. Wong, the way she writes her characters, the way she writes her stories, the way she just writes is absolutely insane. So a little bit about the story, and again, I won't go into any spoilers unless I tell you. So there's no spoilers. This family is set in a traditional Japanese, culture from that perspective, and they are lied to by their government, just flat out lied to about everything, about the enemies, their actual government structure, and they're lied to about their enemies so much that enemies actually show up to their doorstep, and it's up to this family, Masaki, Mamura, who's the son, and Takora, who's the dad. Who, again, I love Masaki, I love Mamura. The dad, we'll see. We'll see. But the story it's just so much more than a fantasy. It's a personal development. Like, I learned so much, not only about obviously these characters, but about myself, about humanity, about how you should actually approach life in general. It tugs at your emotions too. It made me a more emotional person, a more emotional, adept person from there too as well. Like this book literally, I don't really cry when it comes to books. I'm not gonna start now, but the Doug tear, there was like a couple of Doug tears, a couple of them came down when it came to the Sword of Kaigen, and absolutely incredible. This was a 6-star book for me, 100%. And for me, 6-star books are so rare. They're so rare, but when they do get there, they 100% deserve it. And this book deserves it, and it's getting all the praise right now. And I hope it gets more praise on BookTube as well. M.L. Wong, you could give me 17 of these, and I'm down for it. The Sword of Kaigen, number 4, my 4th fantasy book, top fantasy book of all time for sure. I hope this gets turned into a book to movie, book and TV show adaptation. Will I watch it? I don't know yet. Only say that because if you know what happens in this book. If you know. I don't know if I can see that on a big screen, but we all watch Game of Thrones, so it's all good. The Sword of Kaigen, M.L. Wong, truly a masterpiece. All right, so my favorite author right now is Brandon Sanderson. So, of course, Brandon Sanderson is going to make this list. And this book really solidified him as being one of my favorite authors of all time. And that is The Hero of Ages. The Hero of Ages is my number 3 fantasy book of all time, for so many reasons that I'll try to go into right now. Number 1, it's a part of one of the best fantasy series of all time, Mistborn. Mistborn is something that I always recommend to both readers who have never read fantasy before, but also readers who never read Mistborn before. This series is so amazing. To describe it is hard to do because each book in the first 3 books are different. And if you see it in the shop behind me, which you probably can't see, but I have the Era 2, which I will get to, but Era 1 is absolutely incredible. The first book kind of sets it off. It's Mistborn Final Empire. It's called Final Empire, but now then they took the Final Empire off. It's, to describe it, is like a heist mixed with if He Who Must Not Be Named won. Like, actually won. And those two together is absolutely insane, just for the first book. And you can actually read the first book and not read the next few books. I highly caution you not to do that, because you're going to miss Well of Ascension, which is a great book in its own right. But then you're going to miss Hero of Ages, which was my number 1 read of last year. Out of the 53 books I read last year, my number 1 read of last year. Reason number 2, This book put me into an incredible reading slump. Not a bad reading slump in terms of like, oh, this book was so bad, I don't want to read anymore. A good reading slump to where I couldn't read anything because I didn't think anything could stack up to this. Like there was 2 or 3 weeks of 2023 where I didn't read a book. And if you know me personally, I'm always reading a book, whether I'm traveling, I couldn't do it. I literally couldn't do it. Number 3, the characters in this book. Sazed, Ellen, Vin. Oh man. Like those 3 just so great characters. And then a final reason why this is number 3 and was my number 1 book of last series is all ties the series together. All ties the series together. So book 1, book 2 had a lot of gems, a lot of breadcrumbs just thrown around there. And this one just tied all together. There's something so insignificant that happened in book 1 that when you get to book 3, it just blows up in your face. And you're like, what? Huh? What? And Brandon Sanderson is a master at ending a series, ending a trilogy, and there's only few people who can do it. That's why some authors, they don't finish their series. They just have it open-ended. No end book in sight. But Brandon Sanderson, for this trilogy at least, ended it with perfection. And The Hero of Ages, my number 3 fantasy book of all time, solidified for sure. All right, and number 2, if you were paying attention in the beginning of the video, or if you follow me from Booktok, you already know what this number 2 is going to be. It's going to be 1 or 2 books. So to get rid of the suspense, Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. This book really brought my love for reading. Like, and I know they really don't. This book really doesn't stack up to these other books. I put it as my number 2 book just because that feeling that I got on the last maybe 200 pages of this book, to where that feeling is a feeling that I chase all the time. And I want to spoil it for anybody here in case you haven't read it, in case you want to read it. The last 200 pages of this book was just magic. No pun intended. No pun intended. It was literally just magic. And as a kid, right, you remember certain things as a kid to an adult. And when I read this book, this is a book that I always remember in terms of the feeling. I remember books that I've read. I read, obviously, Sorcerer's Stone, Chamber of Secrets. But the feeling that I tied to this book today, if it wasn't for this book, we wouldn't have this. We wouldn't have the Booktok with the whatever amount the community has grown to. I wouldn't be sitting on this floor with the fireplace in the back and the books in the back that are props, really, because they don't even sit there. If it wasn't for this book, I owe this book everything from that perspective, because this book made me into a reader. This book many times just saved me from everything. And Harry Potter and Prisoner of Azkaban, so amazing. My number 2 book of all time. And again, I know some of you might disagree because, again, it's kind of YA. It is YA. And there's other great books out there. But for me, that's why I said it's my top 5 fantasy books of all time. This one holds a special place for me. Would I read it today? Probably not. But I would be remiss if I didn't say that this is my number 2 book of all time. And now number 1. And like I said, Brandon Sanderson is my favorite author of all time. And I read this book this year, and this became my favorite book of all time. Not just my favorite fantasy book of all time, my favorite book of all time. Words of Radiance, the second book in the Stormlight Archive, is, to me, at least right now, the best book of all time. And there's a lot of reasons why, but I want to start with the fact that I actually DNF'd Way of Kings, which is the first book in the Stormlight, years ago, like 2020, 2019, I think it was. I DNF'd that book. I don't know what was going on with me. I just wasn't a Sanderson fan back then. But then I read Mistborn, which is why I always recommend people read Mistborn first before they go into this, because I read Mistborn. I'm like, I'm ready to go. I need these books in my life. Read Way of Kings this year all the way through. That was a 5-star book for me, for sure. There were parts in Way of Kings where it really slogged along, though. Again, I loved it, still 5-star, but there was parts that slogged along. The parts that were really high on there got it to a 5 point. I think it's had a 5.3 star. It really broke my scale. This book right here, 6 stars. 6 stars. All gas, no breaks. There's a couple reasons why this is my favorite book of all time. The first one is the characters in this book. Shallan, Kaladin, Dalinar. Some of the best character work of all time, especially from book 1, Way of Kings. The characters come together in this book so immaculately. Number 2, the battle scenes. The battle scenes in this book were absolutely insane from start to middle to finish. It's just so hard to explain. Bridge 4, by the way, they're amazing too. I forgot that those are the characters, and I really want to get a Stormlight Bridge 4 tattoo just because of this book. Such a great impact for me. The Sandlanch in this one, insane. Absolutely insane. Just nothing compares. Oathbringer had a great Sandlanch, don't get me wrong. But this book, through and through, my favorite book of all time. Some of the best quotes ever. And you think about a fantasy book, and people give fantasy a bad rap, and they're like, oh, you're just reading fluff, you're reading this. But some of the quotes in this book, I'm telling you, to my finance bros, some of the quotes in these books just slap so crazy that you just go around and say it. Like, Journey Before Destination. Like, come on. Like, Where's Radiance, my number 1 book of all time. And it just, the 1,300 pages of straight gas. Straight gas. I just couldn't put it down. I read Way of Kings in 2 weeks, I think. And I read this in like a week, in a day, because I couldn't put it down. I spent hours upon hours upon hours upon hours going through this book because I loved it so much. And this is my number 1 fantasy book of all time, as well as my number 1 book of all time. Where's Radiance, Brandon Sanderson? Thank you. Truly amazing. And there you have it. I don't know how I'm going to be holding this up. I don't know if can y'all see that? Well, those are my top 5 fantasy books of all time. These books are very near and dear to me. And I normally don't buy books. I normally get my books from libraries. If you follow me from Booktok, you know that I'm a big library user. But these books are needed in my possession because I would pick them up at a moment's notice just to read them. And these are my top 5 fantasy books of all time. Let me know in the comments, though. Do you agree? Do you disagree? I'm sure you don't agree with all of these books being your top 5 fantasy books of all time. But I know at least a couple of these slap for you for sure. As always, let me know in the comments anything, whether it's, you really like these books, you don't like these books. Just be gentle. And anything that I can do better to improve his YouTube channel. Again, this is my first video, and I'm loving it a lot. But let me know what I can do to improve to go forward there, and we'll go from there. But as always, everyone, happy reading.